Controversial claims. A Nobel Prize laureate in medicine said the coronavirus resulted from attempts to produce a vaccine against the HIV virus. Where did that idea come from? Is the novel coronavirus man-made, or does it have a natural origin? And why does that even matter? To discuss these issues and more, I'm pleased to be joined by Einar Tengen, independent current affairs commentator, Vincent Racaniello, Hingist Professor of the Department of Microbiology and Immunology at Columbia University, Professor Alexander Gobalendia, Senior Advisor of the Department of Biochemical Data Sciences at the Leiden University Medical Center, and last but not least, Professor Andrew Cunningham, Deputy Director of the Science in the Institute of Zoology at the Zoological Society of London. That is our topic, and this is Dialogue. I'm Wang Guan. So, Professor Racaniello, let me go to you first. Let's talk about the origin of this virus. 3 months into this epidemic, believe it or not, there is still no scientific consensus on some of the basic questions like how, when, and where does this virus begin? Was it from bats to humans in terms of transmission, or through an intermediate animal like pangolin? Did it start from the Wuhan wet market last November, or was it even earlier, as some theories suggest? What can you and your research tell us at this point on the question of the origin of the virus?
Well, as you know, it takes time to understand the origins of viruses. It took many years to understand where HIV-1 came from. It took many years to understand where SARS-1 came from. And it takes time because we need to do wildlife surveillance. And what we clearly know now is that in bats in China, there are genomes that look very much like SARS-CoV-2. So all the pieces are out there circulating. So there's no question that this is a bat virus. It has its original origins in bats. The question is whether it went through an intermediate animal, like many other coronaviruses do, or whether it went from bats to humans. And the only way we can answer that is by extensive wildlife surveillance, which is hard to do and which takes time, as you know.
So exactly what are the missing pieces concerning this novel coronavirus when it comes to identifying the origin of the virus? Do you believe it was, last November, and was it from the wet market in Wuhan?
So I think it is not the wet market in Wuhan. That's very clear from the epidemiology. The very first case that was reported was not associated at all with the wet market. Many of those first cases were not associated. So I don't think it began there. It may have gone there from somewhere else, but likely didn't begin there. If you look at the genome sequence of SARS-CoV-2, the oldest it could have been circulating in that form would be roughly November, maybe October 2019, and I don't think it was circulating earlier because cases of pneumonia. This is a very contagious virus. It spreads to many people, and so if it were circulating earlier, we would have seen it. So we have to assume October, November, the earliest, and then the question is, where did that virus begin? We know its genome sequence. The closest bat virus is a few % difference, so that's many years difference. And the key is to find something much closer, and that's going to be difficult because it may already be gone.
But we do know that, is it safe to say that we do know that it is not man-made, it is not a bioweapon, and it is not intentionally produced by a lab in Wuhan?
I would agree 110% that it is not man-made. It's not released from a lab. It's not a bioweapon. This is a virus made in nature. Only nature could make a virus with these kinds of properties. There's no question about that, and anyone who thinks otherwise is not looking at the science.
Well, Einar, I want to turn to you. We've just heard from the professor, also the WHO and the science community. The majority of the science community came forward and said that the virus has a natural origin instead of a man-made origin. But still, the U.S. intelligence agencies are pursuing this narrative. They are, to use their own words, looking very hard on the potential that it is leaked from a Wuhan lab. But why do you think they're so keen on investigating into that possibility? And why do they do it now?
Well, it has nothing to do with science. This is purely politics and economics. The Trump administration has decided that China is this reason that everything has gone wrong in the United States, jobs missing, et cetera, because, basically because they have a deficit. Obviously, that isn't true. But given that he was ill-prepared, obviously he's behind the curve right now. He's struggling. He's down 8 points against his rival, Mr. Biden. So at this point, he needs somebody he can blame, and that is China, and this is all part of that. You're hearing about lawsuits from states in the United States who are going to sue China because they did something deliberate with this, quote, manufactured virus. Now, there's no evidence for any of this stuff. What you have is a lot of speculation. The fact is, and as my colleague just said, it'll take years to know exactly where patient 0 was and what the crossover was. But this idea that even if it doesn't matter where it started. I mean, the truth is we have to deal with it now. And this idea that casting blame is purely about the politics. It has nothing to do with the science.
Mm-hmm. Your point's taken, but apparently some Americans are buying this narrative that it is the fault of the Chinese, and the Chinese, either intentionally or inadvertently made it happen, and America suffered. To be honest, I just called some of my friends in America, some Chinese, some Americans. They're worried. They're worried that the right-wing extremists who are watching Fox News might, go to the extremes, whereby they may verbally or even physically attack them. To what extent do you think the American public are buying the theory that, it's manufactured by China?
Well, you have to understand that this is not an isolated incident. I mean, China has been the whipping boy for Donald Trump since the day that, even before he got elected, he was running on the platform that he was going to tame China, that he was going to bring it to heel, that he was going to do all of these wonderful things and make America great again. So when you start adding it up, the constant daily attacks, the repetition by the international press, even the co-option of public intellectuals who should know better. What you have is just, the American public is now 90%, according to the latest Pew poll, think that China is a threat. So it's very easy to transpose any kind of new thing as somehow the fault of China. And this is exactly what Donald Trump is counting on. He's hoping that enough people will believe that he's the only one who stands up to China, and therefore he should be reelected. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that's going to happen over this mounting mountain of bodies.
That is unfortunate, to say the least. Professor Raccaniello, I want to go to you. In an interview with French news media, Nobel-winning French scientist Luc Montagnier claimed that the virus is the result of an attempt to manufacture a vaccine against the HIV/AIDS virus because there are somehow some elements of HIV found in the genome of the coronavirus. Does that sound even credible to you?
Completely not credible. This study was pre-published months ago. It was discounted as wrong. So the idea that there's any piece of HIV-1 in this SARS-CoV-2 genome is absolutely wrong. And so why Dr. Montagnier doesn't realize that, I'm very sorry. But he's absolutely wrong. This is not a failed vaccine attempt. There is no HIV-1 sequence in this genome. This is a virus from bats. It was made in nature. And if you don't believe that, then you don't understand the science. And I'd be happy to sit down with you and explain it.
All right. Let's move on. Why do you think knowing the origin of the virus is so important? What does that have to do with developing a vaccine, a cure to this epidemic? If you look at the data, I mean, over 30,000 Americans infected every single day. And that is no joke.
No, it absolutely is not a joke. And we don't want it to happen again. And that's why we need to know the origins. Every human virus we have, whether it's HIV, measles, polio, any of the coronaviruses, all of them at one point came from an animal. And that could be years ago, or hundreds of years, or thousands and thousands of years ago. And so we need to understand the future viruses that are going to come from animals to to us. We need to know what's out there and what poses a threat. Bats are a big one because they're numerous. They're 20% of all mammals. They have more viruses than any other species on Earth, and we don't sample them enough to know what viruses are in them. So for that reason, to know about future pandemics, and there will be future ones, no doubt, we need to know what's out there. In terms of a vaccine, though, we will make a vaccine independent of knowing where the virus came from. And as you know, many, many companies in many countries are working on all sorts of different vaccines. It's really heartening to see the effort going into it, and I'm sure that we're going to have multiple vaccines coming out of this. So those are two different questions. The vaccines we will have, next year we will have some vaccines that likely work, but in the meantime we need to still pursue the origin. We can't give up on this because we need to know where the next one is going to come from.
All right, your point's taken. Professor Vincent Raccaniello from Columbia University, I want to thank you so much for your time and your expertise. Einar, let me go to you next. Why do you think tracing the origin of this virus is so important right now?
Well, I don't think it is important. I would agree with what my colleague said. This, for long-term analysis of what threats are coming down the road, and I mean in years to come, yes, very important, but not for developing a vaccine. What's important about it now is the political angle. I mean, people are literally trying to use this incredible health tragedy as a vehicle for their political and economic agendas, and it's unfortunate. And there's nothing else that can be said about it.
All right, Einar, you know what? I want to play you a soundbite from a person, a member of the authorities in Wuhan, the director of the Wuhan National Biosafety Laboratory, Yuan Zhiming. His lab was accused of manufacturing this virus that went on to infect the rest of the world. Director Yuan denied categorically that the Wuhan lab manufactured the virus, saying that we humans would not have the capability to do just that. Let's take a listen.
From my personal understanding of virology, there's no evidence to prove that the virus has artificial or synthetic traces. Besides, some scientists believe that to synthesize such a virus requires extraordinary intelligence and workload. So I have never believed that we humans would have the capability at this time to synthesize such a virus.
But Einar, apparently much of the Western world are not buying this Chinese narrative. I mean, how can China's narrative get across to the rest of the world?
Well, first off, it's not just a Chinese narrative. The Wuhan facility was a joint facility set up and operated by France and China. And the French authorities, commenting from France, so they're not under pressure, have given an absolute thumbs down to this idea that anything was going on there other than the research that was prescribed and described in the documents and official things. I mean, you have to put aside any idea that this is factual. It has nothing to do with that. It's just simply an attempt, in particular by one leader, Donald Trump, followed by some others. I mean, there have been other supporters of his view that this is all China's fault. And it's really all about politics. It has nothing to do with science.
Right. Hold on right there, Einar. I want to bring in another friend of ours, Professor Alexander Gorbalenga, Senior Advisor of the Department of Biochemical Data Science at Leiden University. Professor Gorbalenga, you are one of the 27 global public health experts who jointly issued a statement in the medical journal The Lancet, where you said, "We stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin." What piece, or rather pieces, of evidence allowed you and your colleagues to make that assessment?
Yeah, thank you for having me. So first of all, I would like to say that our statement was first in support of medical professionals and doctors who are on the front line in China and in other countries. So that was a main purpose of this letter. And second, about origin of this virus. I don't have any knowledge about technology and knowledge which could create this virus with these properties. And also I would like to add that if some people claim that it's artificial, so they have to present evidence for this. And then this evidence will be, of course, reviewed in peer review manner.
Well, Professor, there are so many theories floating around these days. For example, a study by some leading virologists, including Ian Lipkin, published in the journal Nature Medicine, suggested that the coronavirus might have been quietly spreading among humans for years before the current outbreak. How much credence should we give to this claim?
Okay, so it's, people may have opinion about this.
Yes.
And so they have to present evidence.
Yeah, what is your take on that theory that the virus has gone on for years, somehow unnoticeably and undetected, and you know, we are having this outbreak only right now?
So, of course, we don't know how transition happened from animal source, which we also don't know which one, and so and I don't think that we will ever know about how this happens. So, of course, it's possible that for a certain time the virus was in human population before it was detected in China, in Wuhan, in December.
Well, we know that you're also vice president of the International Committee on Taxonomy of Viruses. Why did your committee name this new coronavirus SARS-CoV-2? And why is the naming of the virus so important? Okay, so it's just to clarify, I was vice president and no longer vice president right now. And this statement about naming and classification of the SARS coronavirus 2 was produced by not ICTV but coronavirus study group. And so this group first classified virus, and based on classification, this virus belongs to known species which we knew for 17 years. And species name is severe acute respiratory syndrome related virus. So as a variant of this species, of course, naturally, this virus is SARS coronavirus, and the problem only was how to what the digits you have to assign. And so we assigned 2 because SARS coronavirus 1, you would say, already was there. So it was clear from the classification. You know, I asked.
So this is
yeah. Sorry, I asked about my previous guest from Columbia University on the origin of the virus, and there are still many missing pieces. We still do not know when, where, and how did the virus start. Was it from the wet market in Wuhan? Was it transmitted from bats to an intermediary animal and then to humans? What can you tell us based on your studies?
So, of course, we don't know. I mean, this is simple, and it probably does not matter very much. So, because these species exist in different animals and also in humans, as we see, it is second time it was transmitted from the animal source to humans. Probably also it happened maybe many times also, but it was dead end. So for this species, it's no problem to cross barriers.
All right, Einar in Beijing, I want to turn to you. Is there any way that you think Beijing and Washington can come out of this vicious cycle where one side launches blames and the other side counters the narrative, this war of words? What would you advise Beijing and Washington to do right now?
Well, Washington is going to be dictated by politics of Donald Trump trying to get reelected, so that's a dead horse. The only way America changes at this point is post-Trump world, and that means after November. Whether he will soften or not, and become more rational once it's clear that he's out of office, unknown. But from Beijing's point of view, I do think it's kind of take the measure of the situation. Donald Trump won't be there forever. It's not that the Democrats are going to be soft on China either. They're joining in the chorus. Joe Biden is accusing Trump of being too soft on China and missing a step, this type of thing. So it's going to be a bash China from all sides, election race for president. But China does not have to respond. Do not, it's important not to kind of let somebody push your buttons. And in this particular case, it shouldn't, Beijing should just lie back. Let, everything that China has done speak for itself. In the cold light of day, people are going to wake up and they're going to wonder why they were hit. Why is it that 1/3 of all the cases in the world are in the United States? Why is it that the number of deaths are 14 times more than in China? You can't, those facts, you cannot, change. You cannot make them disappear. You can't lie about them. And in the end, this is what's going to be dispositive. But in relation to your question to my colleague, the scientist, I think you're talking about this link. And what it is there are two unique pieces of the virus in terms of how it binds with the human cells that are not present in Malaysian pangolins and bats. All right, bats have about 96% of the puzzle, but they don't have the rest of the puzzle pieces. So, and neither do pangolins. So that's why they have been speculating that there was a virus somewhere in between which allowed this kind of jump. But right now, as I said, it's only speculation.
But I know you just mentioned that even a Biden White House would not change its China policy. Well, I've been based in the U.S. for 8 years. Many of my friends in academia, in the business world, even in the policy circle, and their attitudes toward China make me think perhaps otherwise. There are a lot of pro-China elements out there. Would you still say that the Biden White House wouldn't change anything when it comes to China policy?
Well, I think it has more to do with style rather than substance. I mean, generally, if the Democrats, if Biden gets into the White House, it's probable that there will be a Democratic Senate. Now, and also a House. So when you have that kind of threesome there, there's going to be more pressure. There'll be more talk about human rights, probably a little less on the economic side. The business will come together and insist that they have access to China because they need markets, especially with the downturn in the U.S. economy. So you can expect it to go somewhere back to normal beforehand, but not completely. Mm-hmm. Remember, 90% of Americans have been told and now believe that China is a threat. That's not something that goes away, and it's not something that even a sitting president with both House of Representatives and Senate can do away with. So he's going to have to deal with it and put that into his calculation. But yes, in terms of dealing on a person-to-person basis, in terms of predictability, having people who are seasoned, who can talk about the real issues, rather than just throwing flack against the wall and seeing what sticks, yes, that would be different.
Right. I want to bring in Professor Andrew Cunningham, Deputy Director of Science in the Institute of Zoology at the Zoological Society of London. Professor Cunningham, the WHO spokesperson, rejected theories that coronavirus was created in a lab, saying that all available evidence suggests the virus has an animal origin and is not manipulated or constructed in a lab or somewhere else. It most likely has its ecological reservoir in bats, she said. What is the evidence of an origin in bats, and then is there an intermediary or intermediate host?
Right, well, in order to come to that sort of conclusion, we need to look at the evidence. And the best evidence we have is the genetic sequence of the COVID-19 virus. The genetic sequence of the COVID-19 virus is very similar to coronaviruses that are known to exist in bats. So we haven't actually found the COVID-19 virus in bats, but we found very similar viruses to them in bats, but not in other species. Now, we haven't looked that well in a range of other species, but the evidence suggests that because it's most similar to coronaviruses that we know exist in bats, that it's likely that a bat host was the original host of the COVID-19 virus.
So why is it that...
you asked whether an intermediate host...
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Professor.
Yes, so you asked whether an intermediate host has been implicated in the emergence of COVID-19 in the human population. And to be honest, we don't know if that's the case or not. From past experience of other zoonotic virus emergence events, it's quite likely that an intermediate host has been involved. And that's for a number of reasons. One is that in the natural reservoir host, in the host that the virus has naturally evolved in over thousands of years, the virus population is usually very small. The burden of virus in the host animal is usually small, and so it's difficult for people to get infected from the natural host. Now, that's not always the case, but in many cases that is true, and it might be for this virus as well. When it gets into an intermediate host, a new host, the virus replicates much more rapidly into larger volumes, and that makes it easier for people to be exposed to it in large enough numbers to become infected. And also, during its passage through an intermediate host, the virus is more likely to mutate and possibly mutate into a form that is easier to infect human beings.
Professor, why is it that finding patient zero is so difficult? I mean, 3 months into the pandemic, we still know little about when, where, and how the virus originated. Are we making any headways at all regarding finding patient zero, and will we ever?
Well, it's difficult finding patient zero because it takes a long time, actually. It takes a while to become aware of a new disease, particularly one that has a fairly long incubation period. So it can take some time, maybe several days or even several weeks, from somebody becoming infected to becoming ill, becoming sick. And with this virus, we know that many people can become infected and infect other people without themselves becoming sick. So it could be that what you call patient zero was somebody who never got sick at all, but just got the virus and then was able to transmit it to other people. And several weeks down the line, they then got sick. So it could be weeks or even months from the original spillover event into people before we started seeing sick people. And of course, by then, it's far too late to be able to identify patient zero.
We have about 60 seconds left, Professor. Countries are racing to develop a vaccine that is so critical in saving lives. How important is tracing the origin of the virus in this regard of developing a vaccine, and what kind of international cooperation would you advise?
Well, to develop a vaccine, what we need is the virus and the genetic code of the virus, and we already have that. So we don't need to identify the original source to develop a vaccine. We need to identify the original source in order to learn how this emergence occurred and prevent future emergence events from occurring.
All right, I want to thank all of my guests today for joining us tonight. Professor Andrew Cunningham, Deputy Director of the Science in the Institute of Zoology, based in London, and our current affairs commentator, Einar Tankin. Thank you so much. And that will do it for this edition of Dialogue. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Wang Wen in Beijing.